February 17th, 1944, Rabaul, New Britain. A morning haze rolled over the wrecked palm trees and half-sunken fuel drums that marked what had once been Japan's most formidable forward air base. At the southern edge of the airstrip, Lieutenant Saburō Shindō's gloved hand traced the condensation forming on the canopy of his Mitsubishi A6M5 Zero. He could hear the low, rhythmic growl of American carrier aircraft somewhere beyond the clouds, a sound that by this point had become as constant as the tropical rain. Around him, the surviving pilots of the 204th Air Group gathered for what would be another impossible day. Their aircraft were scarred, patched with tin from oil drums, paint blistered by the equatorial sun. Yet, despite everything disease, fatigue, dwindling supplies, each man carried the same talismanic conviction drilled into them since flight school: when outnumbered, form the circle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was doctrine, a ritualized maneuver handed down from the airfields of Tsuchiura and Kasumigura, reinforced by stories from China and the early triumphs of 1941. The Lufbery Circle, a defensive ring of aircraft turning around a central point, each pilot covering the tail of the man ahead, was their insurance policy against annihilation. That morning, as they scrambled to intercept the new American carrier raids over Rabaul, the tactic would be tested against a machine they still considered impossible: the Vought F4U Corsair, known to them only as the Whistling Death. What none of them yet understood was that the Lufbery Circle, the very formation meant to protect them, had become a perfect killing ground for the Hellcats' faster, heavier cousin. It was a doctrine born in the open skies of 1916 France, now colliding, fatally, with the physics of 1944. For Lieutenant Shindō, the irony was complete. The maneuver he believed made him invincible would, within minutes, turn his squadron into a slow, spinning target wheel for American guns. 2 years earlier, that faith had been entirely rational. In the first dizzy months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service seemed to have discovered the mathematical formula for aerial dominance. From the Aleutians to the Solomons, Zero fighters performed impossible feats of endurance and agility. Pilots could circle endlessly, twisting through the air like hawks, while Allied aircraft, heavy, armored, sluggish, broke apart in spirals of smoke. At the time, American doctrine still worshipped firepower and protection: armor plate, self-sealing tanks, heavy machine guns. The Japanese, by contrast, had stripped away every ounce of excess. No armor shielded the pilot. No bulletproof glass distorted his view. Their very survival depended on maneuver, on the intimate communion between man and machine. Training at the Tsukuba and Yokosuka air schools enforced this ideology with almost spiritual precision. Instructors quoted from the Book of Five Rings. Pilots were told that the Zero responded not to movement but to will. Flight cadets memorized formation diagrams like sacred geometry. Among them, one diagram appeared again and again, a perfect, unbroken circle. The Lufbery had entered Japanese manuals during the 1930s as part of tactical exchanges with the Luftwaffe. German instructors described it as a defensive weave used by biplane squadrons during the Great War, named after French-American ace Rabaul Lufbery. Each pilot in the circle turned tightly, protecting the 6 o'clock position of the next. Against slower opponents, it was nearly impregnable. By the time Japan's aviators deployed to China, the maneuver had already taken on mythic importance. Over Chongqing and Hankow, Japanese pilots used it to defend bomber formations against the outdated Polikarpov I-15 seconds and I-16 seconds of the Chinese Air Force. Dozens of these dogfights ended with Japanese squadrons forming their perfect circle, machine guns blazing outward, enemy fighters disintegrating in futile head-on attacks. Instructors used those victories to etch a psychological truth: discipline triumphs over chaos. The circle was not just a tactic, it was order itself, proof that Japanese aviators, unlike their Western adversaries, could fight as one living organism. This belief hardened into dogma. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By 1942, Japanese naval flight manuals formally prescribed the Lufbery as a last-ditch defense when outnumbered or caught low on energy. The theory seemed sound. Each aircraft shielded the next. Attackers forced into head-on approaches faced a wall of synchronized gunfire. Pilots practiced the maneuver until muscle memory overrode fear. But buried in those manuals, often skipped over during training, was a quiet warning copied verbatim from German doctrine, effective only against slower or less coordinated opponents. That footnote would become the hinge between life and death in the Pacific. When American engineers at Vought introduced the F4U Corsair in late 1942, Japanese intelligence dismissed it as another brute force design, much like the earlier F4F Wildcat. The Corsair was enormous, its bent wings stretching 41 feet, its Pratt & Whitney double-wasp engine weighing more than an entire Zero fuselage. Early reports claimed it could exceed 400 miles per hour, but few believed such a heavy aircraft could ever fight at low speeds. In Tokyo, staff officers at the Combined Fleet headquarters circulated intercepted American memos describing the Corsair's carrier troubles, how its long nose obscured landings, how pilots complained of bounce and stall. The prevailing assessment, logged in a February 1943 operations circular, was dismissive. Unsuited for combat from carriers, performance doubtful in turning fight. And yet, within months, these unfit aircraft began carving their reputation across the Solomons. Pilots from Marine Squadrons VMF 124 and VMF 213 reported kill ratios approaching 11-1 against the A6M Zero. On Bougainville, American aviators described Japanese formations attempting to wheel into a circle, only to be picked off one by one. It was here that the physics of belief collided with the reality of power. In purely mechanical terms, the Lufbery circle had always depended on two variables, time and energy parity. Each aircraft in the circle had to maintain equal speed and radius to protect its neighbor. Against opponents with similar climb rates and dive speeds, this created mutual defense. But the F4U Corsair rendered those assumptions obsolete. Powered by a 2,000 horsepower R2800 engine and armed with 650 caliber Browning machine guns, the Corsair could climb nearly 3,000 feet per minute and dive faster than any Japanese aircraft could follow without structural failure. Its rugged construction, 200 pounds of armor plate, self-sealing tanks, and reinforced wings meant that even if struck, it often returned to base. When facing a Lufbery circle, Corsair pilots learned not to engage in horizontal combat at all. Instead, they exploited vertical geometry. Diving from altitude, they converted potential energy into kinetic advantage, slashing through the circle at speeds approaching 400 knots, firing short bursts, then climbing back to safety before the Japanese could complete half a turn. To the pilots inside the circle, it felt like being stalked by ghosts. One after-action report from VMF 214, the famed Black Sheep Squadron under Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, described it succinctly. They hold formation like clockwork, but it's a clock with no hands. You can hit any number and time doesn't matter. By the time they know we're above them, we're already gone. For the Japanese, this was more than a tactical shock. It was a spiritual one. Their entire aerial philosophy, refined through years of combat over China and the early Pacific, rested on the supremacy of maneuver. Now, maneuver itself had become irrelevant. Yet even as losses mounted, Japanese commanders continued to instruct their pilots to rely on the circle. Reports from the 11th Air Fleet in late 1943 warned against abandoning collective discipline even when facing superior aircraft. The culture of obedience of ritualized formation flying prevented innovation at the very moment it was needed most. By early 1944, the results were catastrophic. At Truk Lagoon, the supposed Gibraltar of the Pacific, Corsairs and Hellcats from Task Force 58 swept aside Japan's air defenses in less than 2 days. The majority of defending fighters employed the Lufbery circle tactic. Nearly all were destroyed. One American pilot from VF-17 later recalled seeing circles of burning tracers in the sky like halos collapsing into the sea. The old geometry of safety had become a geometry of death. The morning of March 15, 1944, dawned blue-grey over the Bismarck Sea. From the deck of the carrier Bunker Hill, Lieutenant Commander Tommy Blackburn briefed the men of VF-17, the Jolly Rogers. They would sweep the skies over New Ireland in pairs of Corsairs, armed with full belts, 2,300 rounds per wing, fuel to fight for 90 minutes. The intelligence photo on the easel showed the airfield at Tobera, 30-odd Mitsubishi, A6M5 dispersed under palm trees, revetments pocked with bomb craters. Blackburn tapped the photo once with his stick. "Expect the circle," he said. "They'll do what they always do, tighten up and wait for you to come apart. Don't give them the satisfaction. Take it upstairs, dive once, and climb right back out." The tactic sounded almost casual, but it represented a complete inversion of everything Japanese pilots had built their doctrine upon. Instead of closing to engage in a swirling melee, the Americans would use energy fighting a doctrine derived from the mathematics of gravity itself. Each Corsair pair would maintain altitude and speed advantage, converting altitude to kinetic energy in a controlled dive, firing a single burst, and then trading speed back for altitude before the Zeros could react. At 0900 hours, the Corsairs broke through the coastal clouds. Below, Shindō's surviving Section 4, Zeros in perfect spacing had already formed their circle over the airfield, climbing slowly through scattered flak bursts. From his cockpit, Shindō saw the gleam of sun off bent wings far above and instinctively tightened his turn. His wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Hiroshi Nakano, called over the radio, "Circle complete. Awaiting attack." The tone was steady, ritualistic, the voice of men certain that discipline itself could ward off death. The first Corsair pair dove at an angle of 45 degrees, engines screaming at full manifold pressure. Their closing speed exceeded 400 miles per hour, nearly twice that of the circling Zeros. Blackburn fired a 2-second burst, 6 Brownings hammering. Tracers tore through the outer edge of the circle. Nakano's Zero exploded before he could roll. The Corsairs pulled vertical again, disappearing into cloud. Shindō's formation instinctively tightened, each man trying to cover the gap. But the geometry of the circle demanded constant speed and spacing. Once one point collapsed, the pattern degraded into chaos. 2 more Corsairs slashed down from opposite sides. The synchronized defensive fire that had once seemed unstoppable became a spray of disjointed tracers hitting empty sky. When Shindō finally broke formation to pursue a climbing Corsair, the discipline that had defined his training cracked. His Zero, turning at the edge of stall, could not match the American's climb. The Corsair flipped into a hammerhead turn, a vertical maneuver the Japanese manuals had dismissed as impossible for such a heavy aircraft, and came down behind him. Shindō's last transmission, intercepted by Japanese ground control, was a single word: above. By the time the Corsairs reformed over the coast, 9 Zeros had fallen. Not one American fighter was lost. That engagement was repeated in variations across the Pacific throughout 1944. At Truk, at Palau, and later over the Philippines, the Lufbery circle turned from shield to snare. American pilots learned to recognize its telltale shape on radar multiple returns, rotating around a single point, and attacked it with machine precision. Lieutenant Robert Hansen of VMF 215 described the method in a debrief filed at Bougainville. "They think we'll get dizzy trying to follow their circle. Instead, we make our own up and down instead of sideways. Dive, shoot, climb. By the third pass, they're flying in their own wreckage." The mathematical reason was simple. The Corsair's power loading weight divided by horsepower was 5.8 pounds per horsepower, compared to the Zero's 5.1. On paper, that meant the Japanese fighter should climb slightly faster. But altitude robbed the Zero's supercharger of efficiency. Above 20,000 feet, its power dropped by nearly 40%. The Corsair's twin-stage supercharger maintained full output to 30,000. Thus, every time the Americans chose to fight vertically, they rewrote the conditions of the battle. Instructors at the Naval Air Training Command in Pensacola began teaching pilots to identify and exploit the circle. Training films produced in 1943 showed animated Zeros revolving like insects, while a stylized Corsair darted through in slashing arcs. The accompanying narration, dry, technical, summarized the new philosophy. Do not join the merry-go-round. Strike through, not around. To Japanese observers, these tactics appeared reckless, even dishonorable. In a report recovered from Rabaul's 253rd Air Group, Commander Tadashi Nakajima wrote, "The enemy no longer accepts combat. He strikes and flees like a thief. There is no duel, only ambush." But the criticism masked a growing recognition. Traditional dogfighting, the art of turning inside one's opponent, had become obsolete in an era of high-powered, high-altitude combat. By mid-1944, a handful of Japanese aces began to voice open doubt. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Tanimizu, who had survived multiple encounters with Corsairs and Hellcats, told younger pilots at Truk, "If you form the circle, you will die in it. The Americans will cut through like swords through straw." His remark, preserved in post-war interviews, bordered on heresy. For men trained to equate formation with discipline and discipline with honor, abandoning the circle felt like moral collapse. Many ignored his warning. Warrant Officer Tetsuzo Iwamoto, Japan's second highest-scoring naval ace, described the tension in his diary on June 21, 1944. "Our doctrine says unity is life, but in the new war, individuality may be the only path to survival. The circle binds our hands." Yet the machinery of doctrine moved slower than thought. Manuals were difficult to revise. Training fields lacked fuel and instructors. Replacement pilots arriving from Japan had barely 100 flight hours, most in obsolete trainers. They memorized the same diagrams their predecessors had drawn on chalkboards 3 years earlier. When ordered to defend the Marianas, they flew straight into history's most lopsided air battle. On June 19, 1944, during what American aviators later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, over 300 Japanese aircraft launched from Guam, Rota, and Saipan to attack Task Force 58. Many flew in standard three-plane sections trained to merge into defensive circles when intercepted. Against them waited more than 400 F6F Hellcats and F4U Corsairs guided by radar vectoring. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu of VF-16 shot down 6 dive bombers in 8 minutes. Others matched his tally. In post-action analysis, radar plots showed entire Japanese formations, locking themselves into circular defense patterns, even when unopposed, bleeding speed and altitude. Once Hellcats dove in, the result was annihilation. Of the 370 Japanese aircraft committed, only about 30 made it back to their bases. The Lufbery circle, once a symbol of unity, had become a mathematical proof of defeat. The underlying psychology of that collapse runs deeper than aerodynamics. The Japanese approach to aerial combat, rooted in pre-war Bushido ideology, prized self-discipline and group cohesion above improvisation. Fighter training resembled the samurai's kenjutsu, forms perfected through repetition. Victory lay in mastering a prescribed sequence, not in spontaneous invention. American naval aviation evolved differently. Instructors like John Thach and Jimmy Flatley approached tactics as dynamic systems. Thach's weave, devised after studying early encounters with Zeros, replaced rigid formation with mutual support based on geometry. Every maneuver was tested empirically in mock combat, revised when it failed. The result was not merely better tactics, but a different way of thinking. Japanese pilots believed discipline produced effectiveness. Americans believed effectiveness justified discipline. This divergence manifested brutally in the sky. When confronted with unexpected conditions, radar interceptions, vertical attacks, or the terrifying speed of diving, Corsairs' Japanese formations hesitated, waiting for orders or for the prescribed pattern to reform. American pilots, trained to improvise, acted instantly. The circle, which demanded predictability, thus became fatal precisely because it embodied everything the Imperial Navy considered virtuous. After the fall of the Marianas, surviving Japanese pilots struggled to adapt. Some experimented with looser formations or head-on attacks, designed to disrupt energy fighters before they could dive. Lieutenant Naoshi Kano of the 343rd Air Group recorded in his notes, "We must abandon the circle, strike once, then vanish. Our lives are short anyway." By 1945, that desperate pragmatism evolved into the Tokko special attack philosophy. The logic was grimly consistent. If maneuver no longer offered survival, then the only remaining purpose of flight was sacrifice. In that sense, the death spiral of the Lufbery circle led directly to the psychological spiral of the kamikaze. When historians trace the lineage of those final suicide attacks, they often cite dwindling fuel, lost carriers, and industrial collapse. Equally decisive was the death of tactical confidence. Once the circle failed, there was no longer any geometry of safety left to believe in. Meanwhile, the Corsair matured into the weapon that defined late-war American air power. Carrier versions finally perfected deck handling through improved landing gear and training. By 1945, Corsairs equipped every major fleet carrier group in the Pacific. They fought by night and by day, escorting bombers over Japan, sweeping airfields in the Ryukyus. Statistics compiled by the Bureau of Aeronautics after the war recorded an astonishing figure: 11 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost in aerial combat. Of those engagements, more than a quarter involved Japanese pilots attempting some form of circular defense. The U.S. Navy's tactical evaluation summarized the lesson in language as cold as mathematics. Circular defense is untenable against adversaries possessing superior climb and dive performance combined with coordinated team tactics. Translated into human terms, it meant that courage and discipline qualities that had sustained the Imperial Navy through its early conquests had become irrelevant against physics and production. In April 1945, as the Okinawa campaign raged, remnants of the once elite 201st Air Group defended Kyushu with a mixture of Zeros, Shidens, and obsolete trainers. Among them was Lieutenant Saburō Shindō's surviving wingman, Hiroshi Nakano, rescued after ditching months earlier and reassigned to training duty. In a letter found after the war, he described watching new recruits practicing the Lufbery pattern over the coastal hills. "They still draw the same circle in the sky. It is beautiful, but I know now it is a grave." By then, the circle had become less a tactic than a symbol of the world. Japan had lost the belief that perfection of form could overcome the material imbalance of an industrial war. When the war ended in August 1945, American occupation analysts interviewed surviving Japanese flight instructors. Asked why the Lufbery had persisted despite its obvious vulnerability, one replied simply, "Because it was the only maneuver we could all still do together." That answer captures the deeper irony. The circle endured not because it worked, but because it preserved unity amid disintegration. It was the final echo of an age when combat seemed a test of spirit rather than arithmetic. Yet the Corsair's heavy wings and roaring engine had reduced that faith to vapor. The whistling death had proven that in the 20th century's total war, even the most disciplined geometry could not resist the calculus of power. The summer of 1945 arrived over the Philippine Sea like a grey, oppressive weight. The Imperial Japanese Navy was a shadow of itself. Carriers were sunk, airfields cratered, and fuel so scarce that even experienced pilots were grounded for weeks. Among the scattered remnants of the air service, a few seasoned aviators remained, those who had survived the destruction of Truk, the Marianas, and the Leyte battles. Lieutenant Saburō Shindō, once a junior officer among the circle's devotees, now walked along the cracked tarmac of a makeshift base in northern Luzon. His eyes traced the faint outlines of a squadron practicing Lufbery circles. They moved mechanically, turning in perfect loops under the tropical sun, as if the act of formation could somehow suspend reality itself. For Shindō, however, the sight was no longer a demonstration of mastery, but a ritual of futility. The lessons of 1944 had left an indelible mark. American fighters, Corsairs and Hellcats had rewritten the rules of air combat in the Pacific. Where once agility, discipline and courage dictated survival, now speed, firepower, and energy advantage determined life or death. The Lufbery Circle, the proud symbol of Japanese training, had become a predictable trap exploited by technology and tactical innovation. For historians studying the Pacific War, the collapse of the circle represents more than a tactical miscalculation. It illustrates a profound psychological and organizational disjunction. Japanese naval aviation had invested decades in perfecting human-centered performance. Lightweight aircraft, superior maneuverability, precise formation discipline, that training produced stunning early victories. Yet by 1944, the Industrial Revolution had caught up with human skill. The United States could field machines whose sheer power, engine output, armament, structural integrity transcended the capacity of individual pilots to adapt on instinct alone. The consequences were devastating. In battles across the Central and South Pacific, hundreds of Japanese pilots died while adhering to a doctrine rendered obsolete by American innovation. In practical terms, the Lufbery Circle no longer shielded anyone, it dictated their demise. One of the starkest examples occurred over Truk Lagoon in June 1944. A flight of 16 Zeros formed a circle to protect a damaged bomber returning from reconnaissance. F4U Corsairs descended from high altitude, diving at 350 miles per hour. In seconds, the circle disintegrated. Only 2 Zeros survived. The bomber was destroyed. The surviving pilots did not merely lose aircraft, they lost confidence in doctrine itself. The very ritual that had defined their identity now symbolized failure. Letters written home from surviving pilots describe a mixture of bewilderment, guilt, and sorrow. Petty Officer Second Class Hiroshi Nakano, who had survived multiple engagements in the Marianas, noted in a diary entry dated July 2nd, 1944, "We practiced the circle endlessly, yet it did not save us. Each turn brought death closer. I see now that training alone cannot withstand engines, guns, and numbers. We are obsolete before we even take flight." This psychological unraveling accelerated structural collapse within Japanese air units. Experienced instructors were killed or reassigned. Replacements arrived with minimal flight hours and little understanding of practical tactics. Fuel shortages prevented meaningful training, and aircraft quality degraded under wartime production pressures. Manuals remained unchanged, mandating formations that no longer conferred advantage. By early 1945, the Lufbery circle had become a hollow form, a ghost of an idea, practiced not for survival, but for the comfort of maintaining order amidst chaos. American forces, in contrast, continued to adapt. Radar-equipped direction centers vectored corsairs into position, allowing pilots to exploit weaknesses in the circle without engaging in prolonged dogfights. Lessons learned in the Solomons and Marianas were codified into new tactical doctrine. By the time of Okinawa, carrier-based corsairs and Hellcats operated in overlapping patrols that rendered even improvised Japanese formations ineffective. The contrast between Japanese and American adaptation illustrates a deeper lesson in the human dimension of warfare. Japanese pilots had mastered instinct, cohesion, and maneuver, but those qualities could not overcome the material disparity produced by industrial capacity, research, and iterative innovation. The collapse of the circle demonstrates how doctrine and culture, no matter how deeply ingrained, can become fatal when confronted by a superior system. The final phase of the Imperial Navy's air operations further cemented this irony. By 1945, many Japanese units abandoned traditional combat entirely, adopting kamikaze tactics in desperation. Aircraft no longer sought survival or maneuver advantage. Pilots became missiles. In a grim inversion of the Lufbery circle, death itself became the formation, and the enemy's energy-based doctrines made survival for even the most skilled pilot impossible. Among the last aces to fly Zeros, Lieutenant Naoshi Kano noted that the circle had become a ritual of passage into nothingness. Veterans like Kano and Shindō understood that the doctrine they had revered was not simply flawed, it was a symbol of an era when human skill could offset technological inferiority. By the summer of 1945, those conditions no longer existed. Even as post-war analyses would highlight logistical failures, fuel shortages, and industrial constraints, surviving pilots consistently cited the collapse of tactical confidence as a decisive factor. Letters, diaries, and post-war interviews reveal a recurring theme. Adherence to the Lufbery circle, once a mark of professionalism and unity, became a predictable path to death. Yet the story is not solely one of defeat. The human dimension is equally compelling in the American response. Engineers at Vought and Pratt & Whitney, naval tacticians like John Thach, and pilots such as Alexander Vrasiu and Gregory Pappy Boyington demonstrated the power of iterative learning and adaptation. The F4U Corsair's ability to convert energy advantage into tactical lethality was not simply a matter of raw power. It was the product of observation, experimentation, and reflection. American pilots studied failures, refined tactics, and implemented systematic improvements. By contrast, the Japanese adherence to the circle reflected a cultural and institutional resistance to rapid adaptation. Their commitment to honor, obedience, and prescribed patterns, while noble, clashed with the demands of industrialized, mechanized warfare. The intersection of psychology, culture, and technology produced a lethal irony. The maneuver designed to protect life ensured its destruction when confronted by superior material capability and adaptive tactics. Post-war reflection by historians and surviving Japanese pilots repeatedly emphasizes the moral and intellectual weight of the lesson. Saburō Shindō, interviewed in the early 1970s, remarked, "We flew in circles believing it would save us. It did not. But perhaps in those circles, we understood the limits of discipline and the necessity of change. That understanding came too late, but it was ours to bear." This sentiment captures the duality of the narrative. The Lufbery circle was more than a tactic, it was a philosophy. It embodied confidence, courage, and order. But in the crucible of the Pacific War, philosophy without adaptability was a liability. The Corsair's vertical maneuvers, superior firepower, and tactical innovation exposed the fragility of belief untempered by reality. The broader implication extends beyond air combat. Across all theatres of World War I, the pattern repeats. Methods and doctrines that once conferred advantage can become liabilities when technological and industrial disparities intervene. In the Pacific, Japanese naval aviators were not simply outnumbered, they were outcalculated, out-engineered, and out-adapted. The Lufbery Circle stands as a microcosm of this larger strategic truth. Survival depends not only on courage and skill, but on the capacity to integrate new knowledge, challenge assumptions, and abandon rituals that no longer serve the mission. In cinematic terms, the Lufbery Circle became a trap. In historical terms, it became a teacher. The circle's collapse highlighted the shift from human-centered aerial supremacy to mechanized, system-based dominance. By 1945, it was clear. The age in which instinct alone could dictate victory was over. The legacy of the circle extends into memory and culture. Japanese pilots remembered it as the last expression of a world in which mastery of form equaled mastery of fate. American pilots, meanwhile, documented the circle in training manuals as a predictable flaw to be exploited. Scholars examining the Pacific Air War recognize the episode as a profound case study in the interplay of psychology, doctrine, and technology. It is a story that combines human courage with inevitable systemic consequences, a cautionary tale of how beliefs can collide with reality. Even in modern aviation and military education, the collapse of the Lufbery Circle is cited as an example of rigid doctrine confronted by adaptive opponents. Lessons from this historical moment influence fighter tactics, simulation training, and human factors studies, ensuring that the experience of pilots like Shindō and Nakano continues to inform operational thinking decades later. In the end, the Lufbery Circle, once a maneuver designed to protect life, became an emblem of a lost era. Japanese pilots, who had mastered it with pride and devotion, found themselves turning in vain against F4U corsairs that obeyed different laws of energy, momentum, and industrial advantage. The irony is stark. Discipline and skill, celebrated in peacetime and early wartime victories, were rendered mortal by innovation and adaptation. Human courage, no matter how perfected, could not overcome the calculus of modern air combat. As Shindō reflected years later, "We flew in perfect circles, hoping to survive. Instead, we learned the hardest lesson. The sky belongs to those who change faster than their enemies. In our hearts, we still turn, but now with understanding, not expectation." That understanding, born in the twisted geometry of spinning Zeros and screaming corsairs, remains the final lesson of the Lufbery Circle. The collision of belief and reality, courage and innovation, discipline and adaptability, forever etched in the skies of the Pacific War. By the summer of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy's air power was a ghost of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons for weeks. Experienced pilots were gone, either killed in combat or transferred to shore assignments. The Lufbery Circle, once a symbol of unity and tactical genius, was now little more than a habit, practiced by inexperienced pilots who had neither the skill nor the energy to adapt. Across the islands of the Central and South Pacific, Japanese airfields echoed with the drone of engines in training flights that had lost their purpose. Lieutenant Saburō Shindō, walking along a cracked airstrip in northern Luzon, observed young pilots practicing the familiar circular patterns. He watched their wings trace endless loops under the glaring tropical sun, and in that repetition he recognized the cruel irony. The circle, which had once protected them, now dictated their deaths. He remembered the Marianas turkey shoot, and countless earlier engagements where discipline had been transformed into fatal predictability. The once prized maneuver had become a deadly liability. American pilots had long understood the limitations of rigid formation. Engineers and tacticians at Vought, Pratt and Whitney and the Naval Air Training Command had designed the F4U Corsair not only for raw power, but for adaptability. Its high thrust-to-weight ratio, superior climb, and rugged construction allowed pilots to implement dynamic energy tactics that rendered the circle obsolete. Radar direction centers vectored fighters into optimal attack angles, ensuring that Zeros caught in a circle were intercepted at precisely calculated points. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, this combination of material advantage, tactical innovation, and adaptive training became devastatingly clear. Japanese formations, relying on circles to protect bombers and themselves, were systematically cut apart. A typical engagement over Guam in June 1944 saw 16 Zeros forming a circle around a damaged reconnaissance bomber. American Corsairs dived from above, maintaining energy advantage, slashing the formation apart. Only 2 Zeros returned. Letters and diaries of surviving Japanese pilots reveal the psychological toll. Petty Officer Second Class Hiroshi Nakano, who survived multiple encounters, wrote, "We practiced the circle endlessly, yet it did not save us. Each turn brought death closer. I see now that training alone cannot withstand engines, guns, and numbers. We are obsolete before we even take flight." The collapse of the circle was not merely tactical, it was a rupture in doctrine and confidence. Replacement pilots, many with fewer than 100 flight hours, arrived without the depth of understanding necessary to improvise. Training manuals still mandated formations that no longer provided survival advantage, and the lack of fuel or aircraft for practice compounded the problem. By early 1945, the circle had become ceremonial, a ghostly echo of a strategy that once defined Japanese naval aviation. In desperation, the Imperial Navy increasingly resorted to kamikaze tactics. Aircraft no longer maneuvered to survive, they became missiles. The circle, once intended to protect life, had collapsed into a psychological precursor to self-sacrifice. Lieutenant Naoshi Kano of the 343rd Air Group described the transition in his notes. "We must abandon the circle. Strike once, then vanish. Our lives are short anyway." This grim pragmatism reflected a fundamental truth. When doctrine fails to align with technological realities, courage and discipline alone cannot prevent catastrophe. The collapse of the Lufbery Circle directly influenced the adoption of tactics where survival was no longer the objective, signaling the final stage of Japanese naval aviation. American pilots, conversely, continued to refine their approach. Observations made in the Solomons and Marianas were codified into doctrine, emphasizing energy tactics, radar-assisted interception, and flexible formation flying. The F4U Corsair and F6F Hellcat matured into platforms capable of both day and night operations, carrying the lessons of the Pacific to every subsequent engagement. For them, the circle was a predictable weakness to exploit a system to be studied, understood, and defeated. The contrast between Japanese and American adaptation illustrates the broader lesson of the Pacific War. Doctrine and discipline, no matter how deeply ingrained, can become liabilities in the face of superior technology and innovation. The Lufbery Circle, once a tool of tactical excellence, became an instrument of destruction because it demanded predictability in an environment defined by speed, firepower, and adaptability. The psychological dimensions were equally profound. Japanese pilots were trained to equate formation and ritual with honor and survival. Breaking from the circle felt like moral failure, even when practical experience demanded it. Warrant Officer Tetsuzo Iwamoto noted in his diary, "Our doctrine says unity is life, but in the new war, individuality may be the only path to survival. The circle binds our hands." By 1945, that binding had exacted its price. Survivors spoke of fear, disillusionment, and the erosion of confidence. For many, the circle became a symbol of everything lost: air superiority, operational freedom, and the illusion that skill alone could determine outcomes. Post-war analyses reinforced the lesson. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics concluded, "Circular defense is untenable against adversaries possessing superior climb and dive performance combined with coordinated team tactics." In other words, the fate of the circle was not a matter of courage or devotion, but of physics and production. Japanese pilots, trained to perfection within one system, found that system rendered obsolete by machines, innovation, and strategy. Yet the circle's legacy endures not as a failed tactic, but as a profound historical lesson. It illustrates how doctrine, culture, and psychology intersect with technology and industrial capacity. The collapse of the Lufbery circle demonstrates the human cost of failing to adapt and the fatal consequences of over-reliance on tradition in modern warfare. Letters and interviews from surviving Japanese pilots emphasize the circle's dual meaning. Saburō Shindō, decades later, reflected, "We flew in circles, believing it would save us. It did not. But perhaps in those circles, we understood the limits of discipline and the necessity of change. That understanding came too late, but it was ours to bear." For American historians and tacticians, the story of the Lufbery circle informs modern doctrine. It is cited as a case study in human factors, adaptive tactics, and the interplay between culture and technology. The episode continues to influence fighter pilot training, simulation exercises, and strategic thinking, ensuring that the sacrifices and mistakes of 1944 and 1945 remain instructive. The final irony is clear. The maneuver that had been conceived to protect pilots from death became a geometrical expression of mortality. The circle, once a symbol of cohesion and skill, turned into a trap dictated by physics, machines, and numbers. The Lufbery circle's story is thus a human-centered narrative of transformation, loss, and historical irony. Courage, discipline, and training qualities revered and rewarded in early Pacific engagements proved insufficient when confronted by adaptive opponents equipped with superior machines. The collapse of the circle illustrates the collision of belief and reality, of ritual and calculation, of heroism and inevitability. By the end of the war, Japanese naval aviators had learned the ultimate lesson. Survival in modern aerial warfare is determined not by devotion to form, but by understanding the laws of nature, leveraging material advantage, and embracing flexibility. The circle endures in memory not as a successful tactic, but as a testament to bravery confronted by immutable reality, a mirror of a civilization fighting to reconcile tradition with the relentless arithmetic of total war. Even in the quiet decades after the war, historians and surviving pilots reflect on the Lufbery circle with the same mixture of admiration and sorrow. It represents both the zenith of Japanese aerial training and the starkest example of human skill rendered powerless by technological and strategic imbalance. The maneuver that had once defined mastery in the sky had become an agent of its opposite. In the memoirs of Saburō Shindō and others, one sees a reconciliation with that irony. They do not condemn the circle, they understand it. It was a product of its time, a reflection of doctrine, culture, and honor. But in the crucible of 1944 and 1945, it revealed the fundamental truth of modern combat. In the 21st century's war machines, rigid perfection cannot outmatch adaptable innovation. And so, the Lufbery circle remains, in history, both a symbol of human courage and a lesson in humility. The pilots who flew it, who trusted it, and who ultimately perished because of it, left behind a story of profound historical irony. That the act designed to preserve life became, through the unyielding logic of physics and innovation, the very path to death. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.